Hello everybody and welcome back to artofdino.com and SaveEarth.us for Tartarian Tales number 95. It's been a while, but I found something pretty cool that started from one map right here, and this book by Abraham Ortelius, I believe, and about the 1570s I-570. So there's this amazing map which you can take a look at here, and I'll post again later on in the video. And it had a one paragraph kind of, or a pretty long one page description of Tartaria, which I had to translate. So I'll show you that translation above or next after I show you a little bit more info. But then I found something in that translation that referred to the Iron Nail as the where the northern Tartarians may have come from. Just some amazing line in this that I absolutely have to read. And then that brings us to Sigismund von Herberstein, who was quoted in this page as claiming that there was that iron nail where they came from up in the things with the mountain, Mount Meru, etc., all that stuff, that illusory, amazing, magical thing that's up there that nobody knows about. But so listen to this part in one of the translations. A lot of this you're going to read. Some of this main information is taken from the guy who I'm going to read, so I want to only read this one part, which is a little further down, where they says, and since they wander in uncertain places, they are especially fond of the Arctic pole, which they call Selesnikol in their language, that is, the iron nail, according to Sigismund of Herberstein, which we're going to read. And they are fond of directing its curve, which is very interesting. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but maybe that means either controlling it, or maybe making its power the magnetic curve, maybe something totally different, controlling its current, something we have no idea about. But again, that is a pretty serious thing. Selesnikol in the language, the iron nail, and they are fond of directing its curve. So I don't know what that means, but there's something up there, again, they are still not telling us about, and this refers to it as the Tartars are especially fond of the Arctic pole, and they come there, they have come from there, and that seems to be amazing to me. So I tracked down the book and found it on one of these sites, and then didn't even have to translate it. It was in a section on page about 81 called Of the Tartars, or actually, according to this book, it's on page 49 as it starts. So I'm going to include the link below, and I'm going to include the PDF right here, so I recommend you slow down, screenshot this. This is one chapter of the book. I'll include the link below. You can check out more, but I'm going to read the first 10 pages because they've got some good stuff, including this iron nail passage, and then you all can take a look and decide if you want the rest. So you can read at your own pace a little later on, but I also put some AI images in here of what coming from the poles may have looked like in the ancient world, and whatever else that I have come to find. So take a look, and here we go. Of the Tartars. Concerning the Tartars and their origin, besides what is contained in the annals of the Poles and in the little books upon the two Sarmatias, much has been written by various authors which it would be more tedious than useful to repeat here. I'd like to know some of that stuff, but either way, here we go. I have, however, thought it right briefly to write down such things as I have learned from the Russian annals and from the accounts given me by a great number of persons. So this is a very good source here. They say that the Moabites, who were afterwards called the Tartars, and who differed from the rest of mankind in language, manners, and dress, came to the river Kalka, but that no one knew whence they came or what religious doctrine they held. Although they were called by some Toramani, by others they were known as Pieksenigi, and by others under another name. So this could have been when they came down from the poles, from beyond the realm, not anywhere magical, another planet or anything, just they came down. Methodius, bishop of Patanchi, says that they wandered out of the deserts of Ayutriski, lying between the north and east, and gives the following as the reason of their emigration. He says that a certain man of the highest rank amongst them, named Gideon, filled them with terror by saying that the end of the world was at hand, and that they, being led away by his preaching and anticipating the destruction of the boundless wealth of the globe, made expeditions with an innumerable multitude to plunder the surrounding provinces, and cruelly ransacked the whole territory, westward as far as the Euphrates and the Persian Gulf, and thus, after ravaging the provinces which lay in their way, routed at the river Kalka, A.M. Anno Mundi 6533, or A.D. 1025, the nations of the Polovsky, who alone, with the assistance of the Russian forces, dared to arrest their progress. On this subject, it is evident that the author of the little book, De Duabus Sarmatius, was in error in speaking of the people of the Polovski when he interpreted their name as meaning hunters, for Polovski means men of the plain, Poli signifying a plain, Levats and Lovtsi both signifying hunters, the termination "tsi" in KSI not changing the signification, which does not depend upon the last but upon the first syllables. And going back a little bit, talking about that Gideon, how there was like a fear of the end of the world, so all these people may have come down. What if that was another thing by the controllers, like a reset plan from way back in the day from the other realm, that they were creating this end of the world kind of scenario. Oh, the world's going to end, blah, blah, you got to escape here, get out of here. So then people come and leave that other realm above us, come down to this one through the North Pole, and then just start ransacking stuff because they're new, they don't know what's going on, they've got they're in a new realm, they have no idea, they still think the end of the world is coming, they're being taught all this stuff, they've got fear all over the place, being manipulated, and so here they are, maybe. You never know. You gotta always look at all these things from the way we can think now and try to imagine it back then. But as it is a general custom with the Russians to add the generic syllable ski to this kind of word, the man has been deceived by the circumstance of all men of the plain and not hunters. The Russians maintain that the Polovski were Goths, but I do not agree with that opinion. He who attempts to describe the Tartars will have to describe many races, for they derive this name from one sect alone, while they consist of various nations lying wide apart from each other. And now I return to the task I proposed to myself. So it's interesting that they were considered Goths too, but even the fact that you just kind of link those two architectural styles is very interesting, because the Goths had something spectacular. And if you were to connect that with Tartarians, then that means, wow, something amazing happened. And these people were capable of a lot. And imagine what they took down, because Goth buildings are like out of a dream or nightmare or something, but they're amazing. Bathy, proceeding with a strong force northwards, took possession of Bulgaria, which lies on the Volga below Kazan. In the following year, AM 675 or 1237, following up his victory, he advanced into Muscovy and took the royal city, which surrendered to him after a siege which lasted a considerable time. He afterwards, however, broke his faith with respect to the terms upon which this surrender had been made, and proceeding onwards, carrying slaughter wherever he went, he desolated the neighboring provinces of Vladimir, Pereyaslav, Rostov, and Sustal, comprising many towns and fortresses, with fire, slaughtering the inhabitants or reducing them to servitude. He routed and slew the Grand Duke George, who had come out to meet him with a trained army. He also took Vasily Konstantinovich prisoner and put him to death, all of which took place in the year 6745. From that time, nearly all the princes of Russia were inaugurated by the Tartars and paid allegiance to them, until the time of Withold, Grand Duke of Lithuania, who valiantly defended his own provinces and those which he had taken possession of in Russia against the arms of the Tartars, and was a terror to all around him. The Grand Dukes of Vladimir and Muscovy, after they had once yielded allegiance and submission to the Tartar princes, continued therein up to the time of the present Duke Vasily. The annals say that this Bathy was killed in Hungary by Vlaslav, king of the Hungarians, for he had carried off the king's sister, whom he had accidentally met with during the spoiling of the kingdom. And the king, moved by love for his sister and by the indignity of the deed, pursued him. But when he made his attack upon Bathy, his sister took up arms in the cause of the adulterer against her brother, which so enraged the king that he slew his sister together with the adulteress Bathy. These things occurred in 6745, 1237. Bathy was succeeded in the empire by Aspek, who died in 1326, and was succeeded by his son Zanabek, who, after slaying his brother in order that he might reign alone without apprehension, died in the year 1357, or 6865. He was followed by Berdabek, who, after in like manner killing his 12 brothers, died in 867, 1359. After him came Alkulpa, who did not reign more than a month, for immediately after assuming the reins of government he was slain, together with his children, by a certain prince named Narus. As the latter now became the possessor of the kingdom, all the princes of Russia came together to him, and did not depart till each of them had obtained the power of ruling independently in his own province. Narus was slain in the year 1360, and succeeded by a kingdom of Chidir, who was slain by his son Thermerhosha, who, gaining the kingdom by a crime, scarcely enjoyed it for a week. For being driven out by Temnik Manes and fleeing beyond the Volga, he was slain by the soldiers in 1361. Just guys are getting crushed left and right. And this just keeps on going. Fire and sword, boom, boom, boom. This is on page 52. You can check it out. It's just slaughter after slaughter. Blah, 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 blah. So then, depopulating. Okay, let's see. Here we go. His son Shatibek succeeded him in the empire after 1401, whom came Themarasak, who led an immense army into Retsan with a view of depopulating Russia, and inspired such terror into the princes of Muscovy that, despairing of victory, they threw down their arms and betook themselves to the protection of the saints. They immediately sent to Vladimir for a certain image of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which was celebrated for having performed many miracles, and as this image was being brought into Moscow, the prince went out to meet it with all the multitude to give it an honorable reception, and first most humbly imploring it to repel the enemy, he brought it into the city with the greatest respect and veneration, and they say that by this act of worship they obtained grace from the Virgin, so that the Tartars did not advance beyond Retsan. And for a perpetual memorial of this event, a temple was erected on the spot where the image was waited for and received, and that day, which is called by the Russians Stretimu, that is the day of meeting, is solemnly celebrated every year on the 26th of August. These things took place in the year 6903 AD 1395. The Russians relate that this Themarasak was of obscure birth and rose to this high degree of dignity by plunder. They say also that he was an extremely clever thief in his youth, and that it was by one of these exploits that he derived his appellation. For having once stolen a sheep and being caught by the owner, he received a violent blow from a stone which broke his leg, and as he bound it up with a piece of iron, the name he afterwards bore was given to him in the iron, and from the lameness, for Temer signifies iron, and Asak, lame. At the time that the people of Constantinople were sorely besieged by the Turks, he sent his son thither with auxiliary forces who, after routing the Turks and forcing them to raise the siege, returned victoriously to his father in the year 6909 AD 1401. The Tartars are divided into hordes, amongst which the horde of Savolha stands first in numbers and in fame, for all the other hordes are said to have derived their origin from it. The word horde among them signifies a concourse or multitude, but although each horde has its peculiar name, such as the horde of Savolha, Prekop, Nahesa, and many others, in all of the Mohammedan religion, yet they are highly offended if they are called Turks, and consider it a reproach, but delight in being called Besermani, a name which the Turks also are pleased to be called by. But as the regions inhabited by the Tartars are scattered far and wide in various directions, so do they differ from each other considerably in manners and mode of life. The men are of middle stature, with a broad fat face, with eyes turned in and hollow, wearing no hair but the beard, shaving the rest of their hair. The more distinguished persons only wear their hair, which is very black and curling down to their ears. They are strong in frame and of a daring courage, preposterously depraved in the indulgence of their passions, and feeding contentedly on the flesh of animals in whatever manner they may have been killed, except pork, from which they are obliged to abstain by law. They are so patient under the want of food and sleep that they will sometimes endure these privations for 4 days together without in the least relaxing any needful exertion. Wow. That's amazing. 4 days. I swear we've been taught sleep all wrong, and I guarantee it's to just dumb us down. Again, when they by chance have lighted upon something to eat, they gorge themselves beyond measure, leaving nothing uneaten. And with this kind of surfeit they make amends for their previous fasting. When thus overcome by food and labor, they sleep continuously for 3 or 4 days. And while in this state of deep sleep, the Lithuanians and Russians, into whose country they are accustomed to make sudden eruptions and carry away much booty, fall upon them, and defenseless as they are, having no sentinels nor any order amongst them, by degrees overwhelm them. Moreover, if during a long ride they are troubled with hunger or thirst, it is a practice to lance the veins of the horses on which they sit, and relieve their craving by drawing their blood, and they think that this is an advantage to the animals. As they nearly all wander on uncertain tracks, they are accustomed to direct their course by the observation of the stars, especially the polar star, called in their language Selesnikol, which means an iron nail. There's that part. That made it into the later book. They are particularly fond of mare's milk, for they think that it makes men fat and strong. They use many herbs for food, especially those which grow near the river Don. Very few use salt. Their kings, on occasion, when they distribute food to their people, are accustomed to give 1 cow or 1 horse amongst 40 men, and when these are killed, the chief men take only the intestines and divide them amongst themselves, warming them first at the fire to cleanse them before eating them. They not only complacently lick and suck their fingers, greasy with the fat, but also both the knife and its handle, which have been used for the cleansing process. They consider horses' heads as great a luxury as we do boars' heads, and they are only served at the tables of men of rank. They have abundance of horses, low in the neck and small, but strong, alike able to endure labor and want of food, and to support themselves on the boughs and bark of trees, or on the roots of herbs, which they scratch out of the earth with their feet. These horses, thus inured to labor, are used with great effect by the Tartars, and the Russians say they are far swifter when ridden by Tartars than by other men. This breed of horses is called Pakhmat. Their saddles and stirrups are of wood, unless they happen to seize or purchase any from the Christians. To save their horses' backs from being rubbed, they protect them with grass or the leaves of trees. They swim across rivers, and if they happen to be fleeing from an enemy whose force they greatly dread, they throw away saddles and dresses and all their baggage and escape in the greatest confusion. Their arms are bows and arrows. A sword is rarely found amongst them. They enter into a contest with the enemy with the greatest boldness from a distance. They do not, however, continue this mode of warfare long, but pretending flight, take an opportunity while their enemies are pursuing them to discharge their arrows backwards, and then, when the ranks of the enemy are broken, turn their horses suddenly round and attack them. When a battle is to be fought upon their native plains, and they have the enemy within arrow's flight, they do not enter into the engagement in regular battle array, but draw out their forces into a winding circle, so as to afford themselves a freer and more certain opportunity of discharging their weapons at the enemy. They obscure a wonderful degree of order both in advancing and retreating, for performing which maneuvers they have leaders who are very skillful in these matters, but if these should happen to fall under the enemy's weapons, or through fear should make an error in generalship, the confusion of the entire army becomes so great that they cannot again be restored to order, nor be prevailed upon to turn their shafts against the enemy. This kind of contest they themselves from the resemblance call a dance, but if threatened with an engagement in a narrow defile, this stratagem cannot be used, and in that case they betake themselves to flight, because they are not armed either with shield, lance, or helmet, so as to be able to meet the enemy in an engagement hand to hand. Their style of riding is such that they sit with the feet drawn up towards the saddle, so as to be able to turn around easily to either side, and if anything should happen to fall which they would wish to pick up, they can lean upon the stirrups and easily lift it, and they are so skillful in this maneuver that they can perform it while their horses are galloping. When attacked with spears, they avoid the adversary's blow by suddenly lowering themselves on the opposite side, only holding onto their horses with one hand and foot. When they go out on ravaging expeditions to the neighboring provinces, each man takes with him 2 or 3 horses as a supply, so that when one is tired out he may use one of the others. They lead the wary horses meanwhile by the hand. Their bridles are very light, and they use whips instead of spurs. They only use geldings in warfare because they consider them more capable of sustaining fatigue and abstinence. The men use a similar dress to that of the women, except the latter cover the head with a linen veil, and wear linen breeches like those of sailors. When their queens go into public, they are accustomed to cover their faces, but the rest of the people, who live a roving life in the fields, wear dresses made of sheepskins, which they never change until they are entirely worn out and ragged with long use. They never stay for any length of time in one spot, for they consider it a great calamity to be obliged to remain long in the same place. Hence, when they are angry with their children and wish to utter a heavy imprecation against them, they are accustomed to say, "May you abide in one place continually like a Christian, and inhale your own stank." I love that. So that when they have consumed the pasture which they may find on one spot, they migrate elsewhere, together with their cattle, wives, and children, which they always lead about them in marshy places. Those, however, who live in towns and cities follow another course of life. When they are engaged in a war at all of a serious character, they place their wives, children, and old men in the safest spots they can find. They have no justice among them. When a man stands in need of anything, he can with impunity plunder another of it, and if anyone is complained of before a judge for an act of violence or for having inflicted any injury, the accused does not deny the fact, but simply says that he could not dispense with the article in question, upon which the judge usually gives his judgment in the following manner: "If you in your turn stand in need of anything, seize it from other people." There are some who say that they are not plunderers. I leave it to others to decide whether they are plunderers or not. For a certainty, the men are most rapacious, because very poor, and are always coveting what is not their own, taking away other men's cattle, plundering and even kidnapping men whom they sell to the Turks and others, or else surrendering them upon ransom, reserving the maidens only for their own use. They seldom besiege cities and fortified places, but take great pleasure in burning and plundering small towns and villages, thinking that the greater number of provinces they thus desolate, the larger is the dominion that they have gained to themselves. If in any quarrel among themselves a man be killed, and the perpetrators of the crime be taken, they are simply deprived of their horses, arms, and clothing, and are then set free. Even a murderer, after giving up his horse and his bow, is dismissed by the judge, merely with the charge to go and mind his own business. Gold and silver is scarcely ever used among them, except by merchants, and that only in the way of commerce. Once, when a fat Tartar was taken by the Russians, a Russian asked him, "How, you dog, did you, who have nothing to eat, become so fat?" To which the Tartar replied, "Why should not I have something to eat, who own so vast a territory from east to west? Can I not derive therefrom food enough in all conscience to satisfy me? I should rather think it is you who have not enough to eat, possessing so small a portion of the globe as you do, and having daily to contend for it." The kingdom of Kazan, with a city and fortress of the same name, is situated on the further bank of the river Volga, nearly 70 miles below Lower Novgorod. The king of this province can raise an army of 30,000 men, principally foot soldiers, amongst whom the Sarmisi and Subashi are the most skillful archers. They say that the Subashi excel in the art of navigation. The city of Kazan is 60 German miles distant from the principal fortress of Vyaka. These Tartars are more civilized than the rest, inasmuch as they cultivate their lands, live in houses, and carry on various branches of merchandise. But Vasily, Prince of Moscow, has so subjugated them as to bring their kings entirely under his sway, which undertaking was the less difficult, not only from the convenient position of the rivers which flow from Moscow into the Volga, but also from the commercial intercourse which they could not dispense with. The people of Kazan formerly had a king named Chelyelek, who died, leaving a wife named Nursulta, without children, and she was taken to wife by one of Abrahamin, who by this means gained possession of the kingdom. Abrahamin had by her 2 sons named Makhmadim and Abdelativ, by a former wife named Batmasolta. However, he had a son named Aliga, who upon the death of his father succeeded as the firstborn to the throne. But as he was not entirely obedient to the commands of the Prince of Moscow, he was on a certain occasion made drunk at a festival by some of the counselors of the Prince of Moscow, whom he had sent thither to watch the disposition of the king, and who in that state placed him in a carriage, as if with the intention of conveying him home. But on that same night he was driven towards Moscow, and after being confined for a considerable time, was finally sent by the Prince of Volga, where he ended his days. His mother, together with his brothers, had been already removed to Bielorussia. One of the brothers of Aliga, named Kodaikolu, was baptized and received the name of Peter, and the present Prince Vasily gave him his sister in marriage. Another of Aliga's brothers, named Menektir, continued in his own creed as long as he lived, but had many sons, all of whom, after their father's death, except one Theodore, were baptized together with their mother and died in the Christian faith. So it's starting to get in there. And there's a few different things there that kind of just talk about that family. Let's see. The people of Kazan have now rebelled against the Prince of Moscow, and as this rebellion has given rise to many wars and daily conflicts among the various princes who have united in the cause of each contending party, and as the war remains unterminated up to the present day, I have thought it right to describe its reason below. Upon the rebellion becoming known to Vasily, Prince of Moscow, his indignation and thirst for revenge was such that he sent an immense army with artillery against the people of Kazan. When the latter, who had to fight for life and liberty, heard of the terrible preparations made by the prince against them, and saw that they were unequal to contend with the enemy in an engagement hand to hand, they reasoned how they might circumvent them by strategy. After having therefore first openly pitched their camp in front of the enemy, they placed the flower of their forces in ambush in convenient spots, and then, assuming the appearance of being struck by panic, suddenly deserted their camp and betook themselves to flight. The Russians, who were at no great distance, becoming aware of the flight of the Tartars, broke their ranks and rushed precipitately upon the camp of the enemy. And while they were engaged in plunder and trusting in their own security, the Tartars came forth from their ambush, together with the Surmisan archers, and carried such slaughter amongst them that the Russians were compelled to leave their artillery and flee. They're smart. These people are smarter. They came from beyond the realm. They were smarter. They were conquering things. They were targeting things. People were confused by them. They didn't seem like they had the right, they were different talk, different language, different customs all together. I really think this is the migration of the Tartarians were the ones that migrated from beyond the poles down here before the Vimanas and the Indians, or after the Vimanas and all the Indians phase with all that magic that we can't even fathom. This is kind of like the another phase of some reset. Who knows? I don't know. This is all blending together, but kind of crazy because this combines a lot of different Tartarian tales that I've seen into one that just has a lot of really solid information coming from one main source instead of like a bunch of different ones. So very nice, this one. I love this kind of story, and I encourage you all to keep reading, but I'm going to go a little further. It says, in that flight, 2 bombardiers left their guns and fled, but were kindly received by the prince upon their return to Moscow. One of them, named Bartholomew, who was an Italian by birth, afterwards conformed to the Russian ritual and received large presents, together with great authority and favor from the prince. A third bombardier returned from the slaughter with the gun under his charge, and hoped that he should receive great and substantial favor from the prince, for the care with which he had preserved and brought back his peace. But the prince, addressing him with reproaches, said, in thus exposing me and thyself to so great danger, thou hast shown a wish either readily to take to flight, or else to surrender both thyself and thy gun to the enemy. To what purpose is this preposterous diligence in preserving thy gun? I make no account of thy boasting. I have still men remaining who know not only how to found artillery, but also how to use them. Upon the death of King Makhmedimin, under whom the people of Kazan had revolted, Shil, who married his widow, attained possession of the kingdom of Kazan by the assistance of the Prince of Moscow and his wife's brother. He reigned only 4 years, greatly hated and despised by his subjects. These feelings were increased by his effeminate and degraded constitution of body, for he was a corpulent man with a small beard and an almost feminine face, which showed that he was by no means fit for a warrior. In addition to this, he despised and slighted the goodwill of his own subjects, showed an unreasonable spirit of conciliation to the Prince of Moscow, and trusted foreigners rather than his own people. The people of Kazan were induced by these circumstances to offer the kingdom of Sabgere, son of Megnagar, one of the kings of Taurida, upon which Shil, Sheikh Alay, being ordered to give up the kingdom and finding himself inferior in forces, and that the minds of his own subjects were set against him, thought it best to yield to his fate, and returned with his wives, concubines, and all his chattels to Moscow, whence he had come. This took place in 1521. After this flight of, so again, the guns, all those things, way before this, bombardiers, all this crazy stuff. After this flight of Shil from the kingdom, Makhmedkarai, king of Taurida, conducted his brother Sapkare into Kazan with a great army, and after confirming the goodwill of the people of Kazan towards his brother, on his road back to Taurida, crossed the Don and bent his steps toward Moscow. Vasile, feeling at that time tolerably secure and not apprehending an occurrence of the kind, when he heard of the approach of the Tartars, hastily collected an army, which he placed under the command of General Dmitry Bielsky, and sent it towards the river Oka to check the advance of the Tartars. Makhmedgaray speedily crossed the Oka and pitched his tent near certain fish ponds 13 versts from Moscow. Sallying thence, he spread fire and plunder all over the country. At the same time, Sapgaray, who had also left Kazan with an army, laid waste Vladimir and Lower Novgorod. After these transactions, the two brother kings met at the city of Kolumna and united their forces. Vasily, finding himself unequal to engage with so powerful an enemy, fled from Moscow, leaving his half-brother Peter, a descendant of the kings of Tartary, together with some other noblemen, with a garrison to defend the fortress. So great was his fright that he is said in his despair to have hidden himself for some time under a haystack. On the 29th of July, the Tartars made a farther advance and devastated the country with fire in all directions, and such was the terror which they inspired amongst the people of Moscow that they had little confidence in their security, even in the city and the fortress. Such was the tumult which arose at the gates from the thronging of women, children, and other helpless people, who in their intrepidation fled into the fortress with carriages and vehicles of all kinds, that in their haste they checked each other's progress, and many were trampled underfoot. This immense concourse of persons caused the air to become so pestilential in the fortress that if the enemy had remained 3 or 4 days under the walls of the city, they must have been seized by the plague and died, for in so great a crowd huddled together, they was obliged to satisfy nature wherever they could find place. There were at that time at Moscow some Livonian ambassadors who mounted their horses and betook themselves to flight, and seeing nothing around them but fire and smoke, and supposing themselves to be surrounded by the Tartars, made such speed that in one day they reached Tver, which is 36 German miles distant from Moscow. The German bombardiers deserved great praise on that occasion, especially one Nicholas, born not far from Speyer, an imperial city of Germany near the Rhine, to whom was committed in very flattering terms the task of defending the city by the governor and all the councillors, who were almost stupefied with excess of fear, and who begged him to bring up the larger guns, which were used for breaching walls, under the gate of the fortress, in order to drive away the Tartars. So were used for breaching wall. Jesus, these guns. I can't imagine what these guns were like. The larger guns, not what we were told. The size of these guns, however, was such that 3 days would scarcely be sufficient to convey them to that spot, and they had not enough gunpowder even to load the largest gun with one charge. So maybe again, there's another ancient technology that this comes from. The time before this, these people can barely even use these guns. They can barely move them. Again, not giants. Those guns were probably made for giants. For it is constantly the custom with the Russians to be behindhand in everything, and never to have anything ready, but when necessity presses, they are anxious to finish everything rapidly. Nicholas therefore considered it advisable to have the smaller guns, which were kept hidden at a distance from the fortress, quickly fetched into the interior on men's shoulders, but during the delay a cry suddenly arose that the Tartars were at hand, which caused so much fear amongst the townsfolk that the guns were left scattered about the streets, and even the defense of the walls was neglected. If 100 of the enemy's cavalry had at that time attacked the city, they might easily have razed it to the ground with fire. In the midst of their fear, the governor and the garrison thought it best to appease King Makhmet by sending him a great number of presents, principally consisting of mead, in order to induce him to raise the siege. Makhmet accepted the gifts and promised that he would not only raise the siege, but would also quit the province, if Vasily would bind himself in writing to pay him a perpetual tribute, as his father and ancestors had done. Letters to this effect having been willingly written and accepted, Makhmet withdrew his army to Ryazan, and after granting the Russian permission to redeem and exchange prisoners, he sold the rest of his booty by auction. There was at that time in the camp of the Tartars one Eustace, surnamed Taskowich, a subject of the King of Poland, who had brought forces to the assistance of Makhmet, for hostilities were at time pending between the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Muscovy. This man brought up to the fortress some of the spoils for sale, with the intention that when opportunity offered, he should rush into the gates, together with the Russians, who had come out to make purchases, and beating down the sentinels, thus take possession of the fortress. The king was willing to aid the attempt with corresponding subtlety. He sent one of his people, in whom he could place confidence, to demand of the governor of the fortress, as the servant of his tributary, to supply him with whatever he required, and to come himself to him. The governor, however, Ivan Kovar, who was well acquainted with warlike matters and with the stratagems employed therein, could not be induced on any account to leave the fortress, but simply replied that he had not yet learned that his prince had become the tributary and servant of the Tartars, but that when he should be officially informed on that point, it would be necessary that he should receive instructions as to what he should do. Whereupon the prince's letters, in which he had bound himself to the king, were produced and exhibited. While the governor was thus perplexed by the exhibition of these letters, Eustace, in pursuance of his own plan, approached nearer and nearer to the fortress, and in order the more perfectly conceal his plan, the Kness Fyodor Lopata, a man of distinction, with several other Russians who had fallen into the enemy's hands in the taking of Moscow, were restored upon payment of a certain ransom. In addition to this, several of the prisoners who had been too negligently guarded or who had in any manner been relieved from labor had escaped into the fortress, and as the Tartars approached the fortress in great multitudes to demand them back again, and did not withdraw from the fortress, although the Russians in their fright gave up the refugees, this accession of newcomers greatly increased the number of Tartar assailants, so that the terror and despair of the Russians on account of the danger which threatened them was so complete that they were quite at a loss of what to do. At this juncture, one Johann Jordan, an artilleryman, a German, who came from the Innthal, estimating more clearly than the Russians the magnitude of the danger, of his own accord, discharged the guns which had been ranged in order against the Tartars and Lithuanians, and so terrified them that they all left the fortress and fled. The king sent Eustace, the contriver of the above plan, to remonstrate with the governor on account of the injury thus inflicted, but the latter declared that the bombardier had fired the guns without his consent or knowledge, and laid all the blame of the offense upon him, upon which the king demanded that the bombardier should be delivered up to him, and as often occurs in desperate cases, the greatest number decided that the man by whom they had been delivered from the fear of their enemies should be given up. The governor, Ivan Kovar, alone refused, and by his extreme goodness that German was on that occasion saved, for it so happened that the king, either from impatience of further delay, or because he considered his soldiers already sufficiently encumbered with booty, and that his own interests required it, raised his camp and departed for Taurida, leaving behind him in the fortress those letters of the Prince of Moscow by which he had bound himself to pay him a perpetual tribute. But he took with him from Moscow so great a multitude of prisoners as would scarcely be considered credible. They say that the number exceeded 800,000, part of whom he sold in Kaffa to the Turks, and part he slew. Wow. See, the numbers that they use in these battles and these things are just monstrous. And then you hear about, there was only in 1800s, there was blah, blah, blah. There was 1,500 people there. It's like, okay, dear God, so much destruction, so much innocent death seems to have occurred in this ancient past. Again, unless it's all bullshit, which it could be. Who knows? Keep going a little bit further here, not too much longer. I want to leave some for you all, and I don't want this to be an hour long, but here we go. The old and infirm men, who will not fetch much at a sale, are given up to the Tartar youths, much as hares are given to whelps by way of their first lesson in hunting, either to be stoned or to be thrown into the sea or to be killed by any sort of death they might please. Those who are sold are compelled to serve for full 6 years. After that they are set free, but dare not leave the province. Sapgare, king of Kazan, sold all the captives which he took from Moscow to the Tartars in the mercantile city of Astrakhan, which is situated not far from the mouths of the Volga. After the departure of the Tartar kings from Moscow, the Prince Vasily returned again to Moscow, and as he entered he saw standing at the very gate of the fortress, where a great number had assembled to receive the Prince Nicholas the German, by whose shrewdness and forethought the fortress, as I have said, had been saved, and said to him in a loud voice, "Thy fidelity towards me and the zeal which thou hast shown in preserving the fortress are known to me, and I will abundantly repay the obligation under which this act of duty has laid me." Upon the approach of the other German, Johann, who had suddenly routed the Tartars from the fortress of Ryazan by discharging his guns, he said, "Art thou well? God has granted us life, but thou, in preserving it, hast given it to us a second time. Great shall be our favor towards thee." Each of them therefore confidently hoped that they should receive liberal rewards from the prince, but nothing was given them, although they often wearied the prince on the subject and reminded him of his promises. Disgusted at length with the prince's ingratitude, they begged their discharge that they might visit their country and kinsfolk from whom they had been long absent, which was allowed them with a grant from the prince of 10 florins to each, in addition to their former stipend. Meanwhile, a contention arose at the court of the prince as the originator of the flight of the Russians at the Oka. The elder courtiers threw all the blame upon the Kness Dmitry Bielsky, the commander-in-chief in the army, a young man who had slighted their counsels, and through whose want of prudence they said that the Tartars had crossed the Oka. He, in rebutting the charge, declared that Andreas, a younger brother of the prince, was the first to take flight, and that the rest followed him. Vasily, in order that he might not appear too severe against his brother, who was evidently the author of the flight, imprisoned one of the governors who had fled together with his brother, caused him to be put in irons, and deprived him of his rank and his principality. Afterward, the summer came on. Vasily, resolving to revenge the slaughter inflicted by the Tartars and to wipe out the shame which he himself had incurred from his flight and his concealment under the haystack, levied a large army, and providing himself with a great store of guns and various kinds of offensive contrivances such as had never been used in battle before by the Russians, in marching out of Moscow with all his army as far as the river Oka, took up his quarters before the city of Kolomna. Thence he dispatched heralds into Taurida to Matkmetkari to provoke him to a conflict, saying that in the previous year he had been insidiously attacked without a proclamation of war, after the fashion of thieves and plunderers. To this the king replied that in warfare opportunities were of as much importance as arms, and that consequently he made it his custom to choose his own time for fighting, in preference to allowing others to choose for him. Vasily, being irritated by this language and burning with the thirst of revenge, moved his camp AD in 1523 to Lower Novgorod with the view of laying waste and taking possession of the kingdom of Kazan. Thence, marching as far as the river Sura on the confines of Kazan, he built a fortress, which he called after his own name. Beyond this point he made no advance, but led his army back. In the following year, however, he sent out Michael Georgievich, one of his chief counselors, with greater forces than before to subjugate the kingdom of Kazan. Sapgarai, king of Kazan, being alarmed at so formidable an array, sent for his nephew, the son of his brother, the king of Taurida, a youth of 13 years of age, to preside over the kingdom in the interim, and himself fled to the emperor of the Turks to beg his assistance and cooperation. As the youth, in obedience to his uncle's suggestion, arrived on his road to Gostinovosoro, that is, the island of merchants, lying amidst the waters of the Volga, not far from the fortress of Kazan, he was received with honor and liberality by the princes of the kingdom. For the chief priest in that district was one Said, who was held in such great authority and veneration amongst them that even kings in meeting him would stand and bowing the head take his hand as he sat on horseback, an honor otherwise granted only to kings. Dukes did not salute even his hand, but his knees. Simple nobles merely saluted his feet, while plebeians were content if they could only touch his garments or his horse with their hand. As this, Said secretly favored the cause of Vasily. He took diligent measures to seize the youth in order that he might send him bound to Moscow, but when the lad was at length captured, he was publicly put to death by the knife. Wow. So then this goes on. There's still like probably like 10, 12 pages or something, a little bit more. It goes into more detail of all like the government and different kind of things that happened between these kings. And let's see, I'm kind of scanning it now to see if there's anything else of amazing importance. It looks just kind of like a lot of detail and different things, like kind of dramas between the kings and different other things, different family members just cruising through those 1400s and 1500s. I'll learn the wish of the community. Yeah, this is all just kind of a bunch of different things. You can take a look. I feel like you all will like to take a look. I really just wanted to read this today. It was a new thing, so I wanted to bring it all out to you. I hadn't read it before. And again, it's written very beautifully, as all these old things are. And it's written with, again, a little bit of insight from a different way, a different perspective. And this was a lot of the insight that you see, on those maps, on those atlases. They would take info from people like this, who wrote this book, and then they'd quote it. And it would make turn this entire paragraph of this book into a few sentences for that atlas. And so it's great to look at these things because they go so much deeper into everything. And this is from page 49 to about 81, 82 is the chapter, and then it goes into of Lithuania. And a lot of different insight, again, that you can't really get anywhere else. And I'd never heard of a lot of these things. And this is just one little tiny part, like a couple different cities, a couple different campaigns, a couple different battles. And they were talking about 800,000 people. And this is in the 1500s, 1400s, when, again, we didn't, we claimed, people were blah, 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 blah. People didn't have, it's just such a lie. There's so much lies, it's not even possible to follow their timeline of technology and population and anything, when all these places had such low populations at one point, but yet back then people were getting ransacked and millions of people were fighting, millions of people were dying, hundreds of thousands just were imprisoned. How do you even come close to imprisoning even any of that? If you can imprison 800,000 people, then what is the world like? How do you even come close to doing that? That's like a 1,000 prisons, 10,000 prisons, and you've got them all under control. I don't know. I don't understand how any of this stuff works, but the old world, again, is such just, we have to just smash through the propaganda that our minds have that things were super primitive back in the day, because it's just not the case. And we are in a detriment by constantly having to just break out of that, the chains that our education has left us kind of in mental cases like this when we try to envision the past. But it just doesn't work with what we've been taught. But it makes so much sense with what our soul yearns for and what we inherently know and feel to be right and are discovering in this community. So I just wanted to add this little bit here. It's more of just like a reading for my own personal thing. I wanted to just read it aloud and record it for you all as well. So take a look, dive deeper, put some insight below, include some links, share some comments, and do all that good stuff. Thank you all for checking this out from artofdino.com and saveearth.us.